The T-72 tank was meant to be the pride of the Soviet Union. Rolling out of factories in the early 1970s, it symbolized Moscow's promise that its armored forces would crush NATO in a single overwhelming wave if the Cold War ever turned hot. On paper, it was everything a superpower could want. Fast to build, relatively cheap compared to Western tanks like the American M1 Abrams or the German Leopard, and designed to flood the battlefield with sheer numbers. By the 1980s, tens of thousands of T-72s had been exported or produced under license, filling the arsenals of Warsaw Pact nations and Soviet allies across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. It was a machine built for mass deployment, but hidden beneath its steel skin was a flaw so devastating that crews quickly came to fear the very vehicle they were ordered to fight in. Soldiers nicknamed it the steel coffin. The design choice that doomed so many T-72 crews was the autoloader system. To reduce crew size and keep costs down, Soviet engineers eliminated the human loader and replaced him with a mechanical system. At first glance, it seemed like a clever innovation. Western tanks carried 4 men, but the T-72 only needed 3. Yet this efficiency came at a deadly price. The autoloader kept its ammunition carousel directly under the turret floor, surrounding the crew with high explosive shells and propellant charges. If enemy fire managed to pierce the armor and touch that ammunition, the results were catastrophic. The blast would ignite everything inside at once, creating a phenomenon soldiers came to call the jack-in-the-box effect. In an instant, the turret was blown skyward like a child's toy springing from its box, and the men trapped inside never stood a chance. On the training grounds of the Soviet Union, this vulnerability was rarely exposed. But when the T-72 was exported to real battlefields, the truth became impossible to hide. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s saw some of the first large-scale T-72 engagements outside Europe. Iraqi tank crews proudly drove the machines supplied by Moscow, confident they were nearly invincible against the aging American-supplied M60 Patton tanks used by Iran. At first, the T-72s performed well in open desert clashes, but soon as anti-tank guided missiles became more common, the nightmare began. Footage and eyewitness accounts described turrets blasted clean off their hulls, with only blackened craters and scattered debris where once a crew had been. For many Iraqi soldiers, the tank meant instant death the moment it was hit. When the Gulf War erupted in 1991, the T-72's reputation collapsed even further. Iraq fielded hundreds of them, some domestically produced under license and known as the Assad Babel. Facing off against the coalition's M1 Abrams, Challenger 1s, and Leopard tanks, the T-72 stood little chance. The coalition's tanks fired depleted uranium rounds at blistering speeds, easily punching through the T-72's armor. Inside, the autoloader design sealed the fate of every crew. Reports from the battlefield told of entire platoons of Iraqi tanks destroyed in minutes. Each explosion eerily similar, the jack-in-the-box effect. The turret flying into the air, the fireball consuming the interior. Survivors were almost non-existent. For Western tank crews, the sight became tragically predictable. For Iraqis, it was a death sentence. But perhaps the most horrifying truth was this: the crews knew about the flaw. Soldiers conscripted into armored divisions across Iraq, Syria, and later even Russia itself often described their unease when assigned to a T-72. They understood that the moment enemy fire touched their vehicle, there would be no chance to escape. Unlike some Western tanks that gave crews seconds, even minutes, to bail out after a penetrating hit, the T-72 offered nothing. It was a coffin on tracks, a prison lined with ammunition. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, battlefields from Chechnya to the Middle East revealed the same grim pattern. Urban warfare made the T-72's weakness even more apparent. In the streets of Grozny, Chechen fighters armed with RPGs and simple anti-tank weapons ambushed Russian columns of T-72s. With every hit, the story repeated: turrets rocketing skyward, crews annihilated before they could even comprehend what had happened. Videos from these conflicts circulated worldwide, cementing the T-72's reputation not as an unstoppable war machine, but as a mobile death trap. The story of the T-72 is not just one of engineering flaws, but of human tragedy. Each destroyed tank represented 3 lives snuffed out in an instant. Each flaming turret was a symbol of decisions made in faraway design bureaus and political offices, where numbers and efficiency mattered more than survival. The Soviet Union had gambled on mass production, betting that overwhelming quantity could outmatch quality. For the crews inside, that gamble meant their lives were expendable. And yet, despite its reputation, the T-72 kept rolling onto new battlefields. Exported to over 40 countries, it became one of the most recognizable tanks in the world. Nations strapped for cash or dependent on Soviet aid accepted them gladly, often unaware or unwilling to believe the true cost their soldiers would pay when those machines were finally tested in combat. By the time the world entered the new millennium, the T-72 had already earned its infamous nickname, the Steel Coffin. But the worst was yet to come. Across the Middle East and Eastern Europe, conflicts were breaking out that would once again drag the T-72 into the fire. Each time its weakness would be brutally exposed and the human cost would rise. In the early 2000s, Syria's military relied heavily on the T-72. Bashar al-Assad's regime had imported hundreds from the Soviet Union and later from Russia, believing these armored beasts would secure his hold on power. But when the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, the T-72s became both weapons of war and symbols of vulnerability. Rebel groups, often poorly equipped in the beginning, quickly learned that the T-72 was not invincible. Cheap rocket-propelled grenades, Western-supplied anti-tank guided missiles, and even improvised explosives turned these multi-ton machines into burning wrecks. Videos smuggled out of Syria shocked the world. Grainy cell phone footage captured the exact moment a missile streaked into a T-72. A blinding flash, a thunderous crack, and then, without fail, the turret would rocket skyward in a plume of smoke and fire. Again and again, the jack-in-the-box effect repeated itself so consistently that rebels began to expect it. Some fighters even laughed in disbelief at how predictable the destruction had become. But for the crews inside, there was nothing predictable about the searing pain, the instant fire, and the total impossibility of escape. Survivors were rare, and those who lived carried scars, burned skin, shattered bodies, and nightmares that never faded. Iraq, too, once again became a graveyard for T-72s. After the US-led invasion in 2003, American and British forces encountered remnants of Saddam's once feared armored divisions. Many of his T-72s were either destroyed in the opening weeks or abandoned by crews who knew they stood no chance against modern Western tanks. But as insurgency and sectarian war ripped Iraq apart, the tanks reappeared, sometimes used by local militias, sometimes seized by extremists, and later by ISIS. Each time the story remained unchanged. Whether destroyed by American airstrikes, by modern Javelin missiles supplied to Iraqi forces, or by homemade explosives planted on dusty roads, the T-72 could not protect its men. Perhaps the most chilling moments came when ISIS captured T-72s and used them in their propaganda videos. They rolled the tanks into villages and towns, presenting them as trophies of war. But when Iraqi and Kurdish forces hit back with Western-supplied weapons, the T-72s once again proved to be little more than mobile coffins. Within seconds of being struck, their turrets flew into the air, captured on camera for the world to see. For analysts, these videos were gruesome confirmations of what had already been known for decades. The T-72 was a death sentence in modern combat. But nowhere has the flaw of the T-72 been more brutally highlighted than in Ukraine. The collapse of the Soviet Union left thousands of T-72s scattered across former Soviet republics. Ukraine inherited some, while Russia maintained vast reserves. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and armed conflict erupted in Donbass, the T-72 once again rolled onto the battlefield. By then, the entire world had seen its vulnerabilities. Ukrainian soldiers armed with Western-supplied anti-tank weapons began hunting the tanks relentlessly. And every strike was a repeat of history: jack-in-the-box explosions, charred wreckage, and lives snuffed out in milliseconds. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine put the T-72's reputation under a spotlight like never before. Russia deployed thousands of tanks, many of them upgraded T-72 variants. Yet the upgrades, improved armor, reactive plating, slightly better fire control, could not solve the core design flaw. The ammunition carousel remained. The crew still sat inches away from dozens of explosive shells. And the battlefield was now filled with advanced Western anti-tank systems, American javelins, British NLAWs, and Turkish drones armed with precision munitions. Against this technology, the T-72 was helpless. Day after day, Ukrainian drone footage flooded the internet, showing T-72s being obliterated. Some were destroyed on open highways, others in muddy fields, others in narrow city streets. Each time the effect was the same. The turret blown clean off, thrown dozens of meters away from the hull. Sometimes the explosions were so violent that nothing recognizable remained of the crew compartment. Analysts began compiling data, and the pattern was undeniable. Nearly every direct hit to a T-72 was instantly fatal, 99%. The numbers matched the reality crews had known for decades. Survival inside a T-72 was a rare miracle. What made this even more tragic was the persistence of the design. Russia had built newer tanks, the T-80, the T-90, and the much-advertised T-14 Armata. But the backbone of its armored forces remained the old T-72. Cheaper, easier to produce, and widely available, the T-72 was still considered good enough by Russian commanders. But good enough for the battlefield meant suicide for the men inside. Soldiers drafted into armored divisions in 2022 and 2023 often posted videos online, confessing their fears of climbing into a T-72. Some called their assignment a death sentence. Others begged not to be deployed in them. For these men, history was not an abstract lesson. It was their future. The nightmare of the T-72 was not just a Russian or Iraqi problem. Across the globe, dozens of countries continued to operate the tank, often without modern upgrades. From India to Angola, from North Korea to Ethiopia, armies still relied on this relic of the Cold War. And in every one of these nations, the crews faced the same reality. The tank they trained in was designed not to protect them, but to sacrifice them in the name of efficiency. The truth of the T-72 is that it was not simply a flawed machine. It was a reflection of an entire military philosophy, one that valued mass production over crew survival, numbers over human lives. The Soviet doctrine believed that if enough tanks rolled forward, some would survive to overwhelm the enemy. The cost was measured in lives lost, not lives saved. The T-72 was the embodiment of that doctrine, and every battlefield from Iraq to Ukraine has written the same tragic verdict in fire and steel. The legacy of the T-72 is written in the blackened wrecks that litter battlefields from the Middle East to Eastern Europe. But to understand why this tank remains such a haunting symbol, we must look closer at the human cost, the stories of the men who climbed inside knowing what fate might await them. Accounts from former tank crews tell a chilling story. In Chechnya, Russian veterans described how every deployment in a T-72 felt like rolling dice with death. They spoke of comrades who vanished in an instant, their voices cut off mid-sentence by a sudden strike. One soldier recalled standing just meters away when a nearby T-72 was hit. He remembered the deafening roar, the turret shooting skyward like a rocket, and the silence that followed. When he approached the wreck, there was nothing left to recover, just charred fragments, a reminder that the machine they trusted had betrayed them the moment it was touched by enemy fire. In Iraq, families of tank crews often never even saw the remains of their loved ones. During the Gulf War, entire battalions were erased in minutes, leaving only scattered wreckage across the desert sands. Mothers and fathers were told their sons had died bravely, but few understood the sheer violence of their deaths. Coalition forces described seeing turrets hurled hundreds of feet into the air, a grotesque spectacle that turned steel and flesh into indistinguishable debris. For the families, there was no closure, just the bitter knowledge that the tanks had given their loved ones no chance at survival. In Ukraine, the cycle repeated with modern precision. Drone cameras hovered overhead, capturing in high definition the exact moment a missile struck a T-72. The footage spread across social media, where millions watched the explosion unfold. For outsiders, it was proof of Ukraine's resilience and the weakness of Russian armor. But for the families of those inside, each viral video was a personal tragedy broadcast to the world. Fathers, sons, brothers, reduced to anonymous figures in a fireball that millions could replay at the click of a button. The cold mathematics of 99% fatality rates translated into faces, names, and unfinished lives. The flaw at the heart of the T-72, the autoloader and its deadly ammunition storage, was not an accident. It was a choice. Soviet engineers knew Western tanks protected their crews with separate compartments, armored blast doors, and storage systems designed to minimize explosions. They also knew such systems would slow production and increase costs. The T-72 was designed for a different philosophy, one that treated the crew as expendable. The machine itself could be replaced. The men inside could not. But in the Soviet calculus of war, they were expected to be sacrificed for the sake of overwhelming numbers. This philosophy is why so many military historians call the T-72 not just a flawed weapon, but a moral failure. Every battlefield where its turrets were blown skyward was a battlefield that exposed the cost of prioritizing steel over human life. And yet, despite decades of evidence, the tank continues to serve in dozens of armies around the world. The same vulnerability that killed thousands in the Gulf War, in Chechnya, in Syria, and in Ukraine, still exists in machines rolling through training grounds today. The dark truth of the T-72 is that it was never truly a weapon of protection. For the men inside, it was a cage. Once they climbed in and sealed the hatch, their fates were tied to a flaw that could not be undone. It was a prison of steel, one that turned their loyalty and bravery into ashes the moment a missile or shell found its mark. And yet, there is another truth, one that lingers in the silence after the explosions. In the stories of those who fought inside these doomed machines, despite the odds, despite knowing the risk, thousands of men climbed into T-72s over the decades. They did it out of duty, out of obedience, out of patriotism, or simply because they had no choice. Their courage was not diminished by the flaws of the machine they rode in. If anything, their willingness to face death inside a steel coffin only amplifies the tragedy of their sacrifice. Today, when we look at the burning wrecks of T-72s scattered across fields in Ukraine or deserts in Syria, we are not just looking at failed engineering. We are looking at the human cost of a decision made 50 years ago. A decision to value mass production over crew survival. A decision that doomed generation after generation of soldiers. A decision that turned a machine of war into a tomb on tracks. Why are 99% of T-72 hits instantly fatal? The answer is not just about the autoloader or the thin armor or the vulnerability to modern weapons. The answer lies in the mindset that created it. It lies in the cold belief that men could be sacrificed as easily as shells, that quantity could replace quality, that human lives were secondary to industrial output. That mindset built the T-72, and every explosion, every jack-in-the-box turret, every family that never saw their sons return, is proof of the terrible cost. The T-72 remains one of the most widely used tanks in the world, but its true legacy is not measured in battles won or enemies destroyed. Its legacy is measured in lives lost. Thousands of men across decades of wars died instantly inside its steel walls. Their deaths were not accidents. They were the inevitable result of choices made long before they were even born. In the end, the T-72 is more than just a tank. It is a lesson, a warning carved into the wreckage of history, a reminder that when machines are built without regard for the people who must fight in them, the result is not strength, but tragedy. And until that lesson is fully learned, the steel coffin will continue to roll into battle, carrying with it the same terrible fate it has always carried: instant death for those trapped inside.